So, just to invoke the impression of the last two sessions, I want to stress that what I'm going to speak about today, which is the role of women in the Sabbatean movement, is really anomalous. Given the kind of dearth of evidence, lack of evidence we have about the spiritual lives of Jewish women, we hear a little bit of here, a little bit of there, but it's very difficult to make a full picture, and more often than not, we really don't know. We just have indirect references, and what the material here suggests is that Sabbateanism was as heretical in terms of its attitude to women as it was in several other respects. And it really is anomalous, and as you will see in the lectures that we'll conclude with, the last two, I think there is a retreat from it. There is, it's as if there is an eruption of something that had never been imagined, which is scary. And Jewish communities are just going back to very conservative positions afterwards. Okay. So there is one thing, and perhaps two methodological observations. There's a problem with the sources here too, partly because we have a lot of sources, but many of them are polemical. In other words, much of the evidence about the prominence of women comes from anti-Sabbateans, from the rabbis who are treating this as a heresy. So it's like with so many other sectarian histories where much of the evidence comes from the heresy hunters, from the, that's how we were in relation to what was called Gnosticism, when until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, we only had what the church fathers were saying these people were doing. And once this library was discovered in Egypt, we suddenly had their own texts, which actually offer a very different picture, and sometimes don't have anything to do with what the church fathers were saying about it. So we have to be careful, because a significant proportion of the evidence comes from polemical sources. But at the same time, I would say, these sources are corroborated, are supported by a much smaller quantity, but nevertheless a significant enough quantity of sources that can be seen to emerge from within the Sabbateans themselves. They include things like, they're again a bit problematic, but they seem to be the authentic voices of the sectarians and of the heretics. And these are confessions before rabbinical courts of quite a number of Sabbateans who at a certain point are disillusioned and repent. So they come and they very formally, before a rabbinical court, on oath, they describe all the sins that they had committed and are given certain prescriptions on what to do. Interestingly, these are only men. The men are capable of being reintegrated in the Jewish community after they confess their sins and perform their penances. Never a woman. The women, once they are condemned, are out, and this is, I think, because, as you will see, one of the most common accusations against them, against the Sabbateans generally, is that they transgressed all the sexual prohibitions that Jewish law has. So people were having sex with married women with men who were not their husbands. This has terrible implications for the status of the children, who could be mamzerim, the equivalent of bastards, although halachically, technically, it's somewhat different, but that has impact for generations to come. So the women, on the whole, who had been implicated in the sectarian heresy, in the Sabbatean heresy, were actually ejected from the community. And we have a case, for example, of one group of women like that in Lvov, in Galicia, in Poland, who are desperate, and they go before the ecclesiastical authorities seeking help and charity because they have nowhere to turn. So it's an interesting disparity between the ability of the Jewish community to reintegrate men and its inability to reintegrate women who have been accused of sexual improprieties, and the burden falls entirely on the women. Okay, so we have evidence corroborating such acts by the confessing Sabbateans. There are not hundreds of them, but there are a significant number. And we have some of the Sabbatean texts that have survived, also supporting the evidence that we get from the polemical sources. Not always entirely explicitly, but in a very suggestive way, especially on the matter of sexual transgressions, but on other things as well. We don't have a large number of Sabbatean texts because probably it's not as if the Sabbateans were not prolific, and they produced quite a lot. But much of it was not published. Quite a lot of it was destroyed, either destroyed by their opponents, who wanted to eradicate all memory of this, or sometimes they themselves, as self-defense, so as not to be accused. We know of cases where people carry manuscript, quite extensive manuscript of Sabbatean text, and they're caught. And the manuscripts are confiscated, and they are denounced to the non-Jewish civil authorities as dangerous subversives, by the rabbis. So we can assume that a significant proportion of texts produced by the Sabbateans may well have been destroyed. Some of it may still be lying in various places and have not been identified. But those that we do have, in quite a few points, corroborate some of the most outrageous accusations we have in the polemical literature. So the state of the sources is problematic, but it doesn't render them unusable, so long as one uses them cautiously. The other problem with the sources that I would try to put before you, which suggests, and that is my belief, that it's not just that the eradication of gender boundaries took place on a haphazard way, sometimes, but I do believe that there was an agenda, that it was something that was in the Sabbatean message of redemption from the very beginning. As we shall see when we look later today at the one text that I have asked to put before you. But the problem is that this agenda, which I think begins with Sabbatai Tzvi himself, it originates in his own head. You made it, good. We were speculating that people might be caught up because there's apparently some strike on the underground, on the metro.
Not in my case.
Not in your case. Okay, good.
I arrived late from Toledo. I was in a meeting there.
Oh God, I'm sorry. Okay, I appreciate that you made the effort. Okay, I'm just talking about the problem of the sources we have for the information I'm going to put before you about the position of women in Sabbateanism. The one point I made, that the evidence is problematic because a lot of it comes from anti-Sabbatean, polemical sources, and has a bias. And I should have said that, in fact, in the kind of rabbinical Jewish world, to say that something like the Sabbatean message of redemption, Sabbatean messianism, is particularly attracted to women, or that women are very prominent in it, is in itself a denigration of it. Because it is something, if the women are attracted to it, it can't be serious, So you can suspect the polemicists of highlighting, maybe exaggerating, the prominence of women in order to show that this thing has nothing to do with the rabbinical value system, that it is not really proper Jewish, So it would have been a strategy that can be suspected of exaggerating the degree to which women were involved. Okay. All right, I'm not going to repeat again, I'm just talking about the sources and the problem of the sources. And the other problem of the sources that I was just concluding what I had to say about is that even though, as I believe and I hope I can persuade you, we have got an actual agenda, a program that was conceived in Sabbatai Tzvi's mind from the very beginning. He is somebody who very exceptionally is very alert to the question of the position of women and wants to do something about it for certain reasons that I will try to explain, perhaps historical, perhaps literary. But the problem is that the evidence as we have it does not suggest that this agenda was ever implemented systematically, So it crops up in different contexts. Here and there are gaps. You have to reconstruct it with some effort, and you haven't got answers to all the questions. Şabbetay Șebí himself was not a person who is capable of articulating and implementing any agenda. He was a visionary, a very charismatic person, but not one who was able, he never formulated a complex theological position, or it was Nathan of Gaza, his prophet, and a group of other, Abraham Miguel Cardozo, another famous Sabbatean prophet, who produced theological treatises in which the Sabbatean message is articulated in Kabbalistic terms, in very complex Kabbalistic terms. Şabbetay Șebí's such writings as we have by him, and the attribution to him is generally still questionable. Some we know for certain, but that's a very small corpus. Most have been attributed, but we don't know for sure, are very different, much more personal, much more spontaneous, and kind of lacking in a coherent structure. They are more the impressions of somebody who is constantly receiving messages, but who is not managing to work them into a coherent program. So the agenda, to the extent that we have it, and I believe we have it, is sometimes very prominent in what happens in the implementation, and sometimes you have to reconstruct it from fragments, from little fragments. So it is not a straight line, but it is a rather tortuous line that sometimes is thick, and sometimes is very thin, and sometimes it's filled up with ... But nevertheless, it is present from the very beginning, as I say, from Şabbetay Șebí's first public pronouncements, right to the very end of the phenomenon as an underground network of small sects in the very late 18th century and up to, I would say, I used, in the title of my book, I used the date 1816 as the cutting off point, which is also arbitrary, because it dies slowly at the beginning of the 19th century, but 1816 is significant because it is the death of Jacob Frank's daughter, who is the Messianic figure in this particular transmutation, incarnation of the Sabbatean movement in Poland and Germany. Okay. So the first area in which the presence of women is strikingly prominent, almost overwhelmingly, is mass prophecy. There are dozens and dozens of descriptions by eyewitness accounts, Jewish, non-Jewish, both Christians and Muslims, of this phenomenon of almost mass hysteria, where you have hundreds of people in a public place prophesying, and they are described as hysterical, as having ecstatic experiences. Sometimes they are compared to epileptics. They're having fits. They foam in the mouth. They shout and scream, usually not anything particularly coherent, but a string of biblical verses about Messianic redemption. Sometimes just the name of Şabbetay Șebí, Messiah of Israel, repetitively. They appear to be unconscious of where they are or what they're doing, and when the fit subsides, they pass out. And when they wake up, they don't know what they've been saying. These descriptions repeat time and time again, and what is so striking about them is they say men and women, and sometimes we're given estimates. Now, I don't know how reliable these estimates, to this day, you can never be sure that a big demonstration by a political party is said in one paper to have attracted 1 million people, in another one 20,000. These are, but what is striking is that they say as many men as women, sometimes more women. We have figures of 420 men and 450 women. women of all ages. They say sometimes young girls. Occasionally you have references to women who are not Jewish, who are swept by this, and they're also screaming and foaming in the mouth and saying, Sabbatai Tzvi, Messiah of Israel. The people who record these things for us, who I say are not always Jewish, not necessarily, there are some Jewish observers in correspondence, but there is one remarkable source, an eyewitness, a Dutch Protestant clergyman by the name of Thomas Kuhnen, who was sent from Holland to Smyrna, to Izmir, which is a town where Sabbatai Tzvi first publicly proclaims himself Messiah in the winter of 1665. This man was sent to the community of Dutch merchants who were resident in Smyrna. Smyrna is a port town, and merchants are very, common on the landscape. So they had this Dutch Protestant minister to look after their spiritual well-being, and he is very interested in enthusiasm, in the phenomenon of enthusiasm, which is something that becomes the subject of much criticism by church establishments, both Catholic and Protestant, during this period. People who are ecstatic, who are prophetic, who are, this is a suspicious activity, and there's quite a lot of literature denouncing it. There's a beautiful book about this by an Israeli historian, but it is a Michael Head on enthusiasm as a phenomenon in the early modern period that arouses much criticism. Now, this man, Thomas Kuhnen, is very critical of it, and he's very interested in it. He compares, for example, the upheaval of the Sabbateans in Smyrna, that is where he lives and he witnesses it on a daily basis, to other Protestant cases. He says the Quakers are just as bad, and the Shakers, he has names, and the Hornhooks, he has names of other sects, and he attributes the same kind of activity. People standing up and prophesying and becoming hysterical. So in that context, he describes to us what he sees, and his descriptions are very tangible. He's also the author, the person who recorded that speech by Sabbatai Tzvi that we shall look at together, those few lines that we have. But we have, I'll give you a brief summary. I have the Hebrew text in front of me, a Jewish observer who says they fall on the ground as if they were dead. And after about a half an hour, so he says they begin by passing out, they fall on the ground. After about a half an hour, they begin to speak. The air comes out of their mouth, and the sounds are heard without their lips even moving. So it is automatic speech he's describing. And what they say are verses of praise and verses of consolation. And they all shout out, Sabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah of the God of Jacob. And then they stand up and they don't remember anything of what had happened to them. We have dozens of such descriptions. There's one beautiful one that I'll share with you, and this one is an 18th century. This one is at the time of Sabbatai Tzvi's own first eruption in the 1660s in Izmir. This one is from, and they go right through the whole period, from the mid-17th century until the disappearance, the assimilation of the last sectarians in society, either Jewish or not, by the beginning of the 19th century. This one is reported by one of the biggest, the most fanatical heresy hunters of the 18th century, and this is a German rabbi by the name of Jacob Emden, who is a prolific author. He also created a printing press in his own house in Altona near Hamburg, and he's such a cantankerous person. He quarrels with the whole world. He's a frustrated and angry man, a typical fanatic, he had so many enemies that nobody would print his books, so he created his own printing press, and all his books were published, first editions, in his own printing press from the 1740s until the 1770s. and they are diabolical. I mean, they're more difficult to read than manuscripts, they're so badly done, but anyway, they're very rich sources. And Emden describes in the name of his father, going back one generation back. His father is a very well-known rabbinic scholar as well. So was Emden. He's the author of very influential and important responsa. His father, Chacham Ashkenazi, paradoxically, he's called Ashkenazi and he's got a Sephardi title, Chacham. And this is because he was based in Amsterdam. And the Sephardi community of Amsterdam respected him so much that they gave him the title of Chacham, even though he was the rabbi of the Ashkenazi community. Amsterdam had both. At any rate, the Chacham Tzvi was a child at the time of Sabbatai Tzvi. He was about 10 years old. He was born in the mid-50s. And when Sabbatai Tzvi first appears on the arena as the Messiah in 1666, he is 10, 11 years old. And Emden says, my father told me that as a child in Smyrna, he witnessed, he says, there was at the time of the Shabbat, it's nice, he's so angry with the sectarians. So when he refers to Šabbetay Șebí, the time of Šabbetay Șebí, he uses the acronym Shabbat in Hebrew, as the Hebrew likes doing, which actually means a heart attack, which means, whenever he mentions his name, he would append to it the acronym Yud Shin Vav. Yud Shin Vav, which can also mean Jesus. That's the way Jesus' name is spelled in Hebrew, and often with an inverted comma to indicate it's kind of a special name. But there it is, Yimach Shmo V'Zichro. May his name be wiped out, and his name and his memory be wiped out. So here we have, at the time, he was a child at the time of Šabbetay Șebí, and he testified that there were women there who would say, this is publicly in the street, you could see the scenes, let us go and kill demons. And they would wear white linen clothes, and they would make gestures, he's using the language of ritual slaughter, which is also the language of the way the high priest is supposed to perform the sacrificial act on Yom Kippur. And also the white clothes. They're wearing linen white clothes like the high priest. And they're doing holacha. They're moving their hands in the air, backwards and forward, as if they were slaughtering. But they're slaughtering demons, not a bull or, a sacrifice. And with their hands stretched out in the air, they move back and forth, spreading their white cloth, the clothes, their white robes, their white asimla, the white robe, to receive the blood that was flowing from the air. And we could all see the blood. So they were performing a ritual of imaginary slaughtering of demons, but the audience could see the blood dripping onto their white linen dress. As if with their hands they shed a lot of blood by means of stretching their hands up in the air. And the stream of blood was visible as if a ritual slaughtering had been performed. And one of them said, whoever wants to, I'll give them the scent of paradise, the good smell of paradise. Now this is a concept that has old Kabbalistic origins. The holy Ali, the Kabbalistic master of the 16th century in Safed, was said to emit a scent of paradise. So was Sabbatai Șebí himself. So was his prophet, Nathan of Gaza. And subsequently, very distinguished Kabbalists were said to have, wherever they went, you could smell the wonderful scent of paradise. So these women are empowered to distribute this scent. They say, whoever wants to, will give them the scent of paradise. And she made a cup shape in her hand, also in the air, received the scent of paradise, and with her hands handed it out, and we could all feel a very pleasant scent. This is a description of a street scene. Whoever wanted it had it. So I don't know what actually happened, but that this is what the people believed that they saw. It's very dramatic. These women are powerful. They're killing demons. They're giving people the sense of, and they're prophesying Sabbatai Tzvi. So I'm skipping a lot. I have so many other descriptions. They're very striking. Suffice to say that there are lots of them. Maybe I'll mention one other extraordinary thing. Lots of women are said to have had, and this is again an old concept, a very, very lofty concept, a revelation of Elijah. That is to say, Elijah the prophet, who in Jewish tradition is believed to be the announcer, the herald of the redemption. He will come and say, redemption is here, the Messiah is here. People have traditionally had experiences. These are great saintly figures who had all kinds of means of, all men communicating with the upper world, would say things in the name of a revelation of Elijah that they had, a very lofty. Here we have an inflation of a revelation of Elijah, and all these women are claiming to have had it. Unheard of, and people take what they say seriously. Their prophecies are respected. I would say, as an aside, that prophecy is a very problematic concept in the rabbinical world. There is a famous Talmudic saying, which is invoked time and again, a sage is preferable to a prophet. Chacham adif min navi. We would much, now that the temple is destroyed and there are no longer biblical prophets around, the revelation, divine revelation, has come to an end. Direct revelation, such as had Moses or the prophets. The biblical canon, basically, is the last direct revelation we had. And anything else, according to the rabbinic perspective, not according to the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls or to Hellenistic Jews, but within the rabbinical world, the opinion is clearly formed that from now on we interpret. So Chacham, a sage, his role is to interpret the revelation. So, and there's always a certain measure of suspicion about anybody who comes and claims to have fresh revelations. That does not mean to say that within the rabbinical world, even in the Talmud and certainly later on, there were not people who were hearing and reporting new revelations. But they're not called nevuah, they're not called prophecy. There are various devices that the Talmud allows. So there is bat kol. Bat kol, for example, is an echo. So people hear an echo. There are various other, sounds that people hear that are never dignified by the full title of prophecy, but effectively are like prophecy and do, in fact, offer a fresh, direct revelation communicated to particular distinguished individuals. Mm-hmm. What we have here is a sudden revival of prophecy as a legitimate and very rich source of fresh revelations that are attributed to men and women. But the number of women who are described as having it and the authority they exert because of it is very striking. There is a description that is quite sad, reported by Abraham Miguel Cardozo. This is a prophet of Sabbatai Tzvi who comes in the generation after Sabbatai Tzvi's death, and in a certain respect becomes gradually convinced that he himself might be a successor Messiah. Maybe not Messiah, son of David, Messiah, son of Joseph or Ephraim, that kind of split within rabbinic culture between the two. One paves the way for the other. So at a certain point he arrived at the conclusion that maybe he is the new paver of the way for the final revelation of maybe Sabbatai Tzvi would return or some other. He clearly had a very complex sense of himself as both prophet and Messiah. He is also a brilliant scholar. He's a former converso, brought up in Spain and graduate of the University of Salamanca, and a doctor, a very famous doctor, who returns to Judaism, possibly under the influence of his brother Isaac, who became a very powerful Jewish apologist in the period. explaining the advantages, the excellence of Judaism against Christianity. And he clearly was one of those conversos who arrived in the country. He traveled a lot. He first went to North Africa, he then went to the Ottoman Empire, he was in Tripoli, he was, and all over Europe as well, traveled a lot. At a certain point, he would have had to be circumcised because he arrived uncircumcised. So he describes himself. We have a long treatise by him, which is very autobiographical, in which he says, a woman stopped me, I forget, I think it was in Edrene, in Adrianople, Edrene. A woman stops him in the street and points at him and says, I've had an Elijah revelation, and I know that your circumcision is not according to Jewish law, and you need to do it again. And she shouts at him, and he's very embarrassed, and within minutes, he said, there was a whole crowd around him, and they're listening to her. So she exerts this authority on the strength of her revelation of Elijah that exposes him, a great scholar and quite a man who's got a reputation within the Sabbatean movement, and wants him to, and he says, I try to explain to her that I know what she means, but there was a problem with my circumcision, but it is done according to Jewish law, and there was no, she wouldn't have nothing. She continued to shout at him until he eventually escapes, with a kind of rather hostile reaction of the people around him. So this is unimaginable in other settings, that women should take this public position, exposing a learned sage, and a prominent Sabbatean figure in this way. Now, this phenomenon in itself is so extraordinary, and it's not only extraordinary to us looking at it back, but it is clearly perceived as extraordinary to contemporaries. That women should be privy to such revelations and should be empowered in this way, they thought was completely unnatural. And if it is unnatural, it is supernatural. So it was circulating in the news as miraculous. Something miraculous has happened, and women have been granted these powers, and all the other people who were empowered by prophecy. But especially in the case of the women, this becomes a wonderful propaganda tool. And the Sabbatean prophets, and Nathan of Gaza is very good at it, are disseminating it as proof of the authenticity of the prophecy and of Sabbatai Tzvi's messiahship. If this was not the real Messiah, if the message I'm giving you is not true about the redemption that is near, then surely all these miraculous things would not happen, and these women would not be privileged with these powers, So women, we have quite a lot of evidence of women taking the lead. They are convincing skeptical men that the message of Sabbatai Tzvi is authentic. For example, there's a long description of the daughters of two very wealthy householders in Smyrna, Izmir. His name we know, Chaim Pena. He was a very well-to-do and influential member of the community, and he was one of the group of prominent Sephardi householders who were very suspicious of Sabbatai Tzvi when he first emerged. They were preferring to wait and see, were not swept by this enthusiasm. Much to his embarrassment, his two young daughters, virgins, and I stress virgin because we are going to come back to the significance of virginity here, began to prophesy that Sabbatai Tzvi, and he at first was trying to stop them, but people heard and started going to his house to listen to the prophecies of these girls, and eventually he himself became one of Sabbatai Tzvi's richest and most enthusiastic supporters under the influence of the miraculous prophesying of his daughters. This is by no means the only case. We have an interesting account. It was first published by Arlene Shulam in the 1940s, of the emergence of the Messianic movement in Galata, which is the European quarter of Constantinople. And it begins when a young girl, a virgin again, the daughter of, again, a wealthy and prominent person, begins to prophesy, and before long, she becomes a pilgrim site. People from all over go to listen to her prophecies and bring her gifts, and she becomes a powerful voice in the area that persuades people that the Messianic message is true. And another quite independent text tells us exactly the same in Corfu. And here the source is not Jewish, it is actually a very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic work by an Italian nobleman who wrote a history of the island of Corfu. And he has a chapter in it about this episode, which he says comes to him from the mouth of a young nobleman of his acquaintance, who was so intrigued by the rumors of what was going on amongst the Jews, the great upheaval amongst the Jews on the island, that he pretended to be a Jew. He dressed up like a beggar, which is interesting. He tells you what the economic situation of the Jews at that moment in Corfu, in order to get into the house of the young girl who is the daughter of a wealthy Jewish merchant from Venice who went bankrupt in Venice. And that's why he ended up in Corfu. So this girl begins to prophesy about the redemption that is here. And pretty soon, all the Jews on the island flock to that house to listen to her prophecies. And this young Italian nobleman was so curious about what was going on that he dressed up like a Jew, he says like a beggar Jew, and they let him in. So he stood there and witnessed all this and told the author, Andrea Marmara, I think is his name, who then included it as a chapter in his book. So here we have no particular interest, either polemical or an apologetic Sabbatean, a complete outside observer capturing an incident that corroborates, that fits in with the general picture where young girls, virgins, they're all described as virgins, are particularly receptive to these prophetic spiritual experiences and are mobilizing other people to... Now, Sarah, the wife, the third wife of Sabbatai Tzvi, Sabbatai Tzvi has a problematic sexual history. We have some of his own descriptions about nightmares he had already as a teenager, as a boy entering puberty, about his penis being on fire and the pain that he suffers from it. He clearly had problems. And he was clearly ascetic. He was a Kabbalist. We know that he studied only 2 Kabbalistic books. We have exactly the syllabus that he chose. He didn't study with a teacher, which is unusual. Usually Kabbalah is taught by master to pupil. He went on his own, studied Zohar, and studied one other work, Sefer HaKana, the book of Kana. I'll say something about it later on. And he was clearly an ascetic Kabbalist, which very often was the case. The Kabbalists often chose a celibate and ascetic way of life, at least for periods in their lives. At a certain stage, as a young boy, a young man, the son of a fairly well-to-do merchant in Izmir, his father, he was married, but wouldn't consummate the marriage. So the family of the bride annulled the marriage, and then he was married again, and again he wouldn't consummate the marriage, a bit like the maid of Ludmir I mentioned last time, and again the marriage was annulled. So technically he had 2 previous wives, and finally he marries for the 3rd time, at a point at which he's already famous as the Messiah, in Egypt. He meets a girl who had traveled all the way from Poland, right through Europe, and the stories about her are so colorful, very difficult to verify. But she's a Polish girl whose parents were murdered during one of the kind of catastrophes of Jewish historiography, the massacres of 1648-49 in Poland, where in the heat of the Cossack-led peasant uprising in Poland in those years, which are really the first sign of the ultimate disintegration of Poland as a state, when by the end of the century, of the 18th century, there's no longer Poland. This was the beginning of this process. The Jews were targeted by the rebels because they were associated with the nobility, with the Polish nobility, whose agents they usually were. So the Polish nobility was mostly absentee. They were sitting somewhere else. And the Jews were there representing the oppressive regime of the Polish nobility on the peasants. And so wherever possible, the Jews, and we have reports, again, numbers are difficult to be sure about, but large-scale losses in life, in property, whole Jewish communities were wiped out during these events. So this girl called Sarah, everybody says she's Sarah, was an orphan who survived the massacre in which her two parents died, and was taken in by some nuns and was brought up as a Catholic until her high teenage. When she was about 16, she had a vision that revealed to her that she was of Jewish origin, and not only that she was destined to be the bride of the Jewish Messiah. She had a consciousness of being, this is how the stories go. And then she started traveling. She went to Italy, she was living in various Italian towns. She went down through Palestine to Egypt, which is where she found Sabbatai Tsevi, and according to the stories, presented herself to him, I am your bride, I'm destined to be the Messiah's bride, and he married her. Whether it's true or not, we can't tell. We also can't tell whether the story is about the fact that she lived as a prostitute, that she slept with all kinds of men, lots of wild imaginings. But one thing that is interesting, observed by somebody who was living in Livorno, in Lego, at the time, when she was living there, and that is the poet Immanuel Francis. This is an important one of two brothers, Immanuel Jacob Francis, Italian Jewish poets, who produced, in fact, a whole book, an anti-Sabbatean book, wanting to really debunk the whole phenomenon, and they observed it in situ, when they were eyewitness accounts to the upheavals in Livorno. And he says that there's a time that she, and this is not in a poetic passage, but in a narrative passage embedded in this anti-Sabbatean book, he says, this woman, Sarah, when she was living in Livorno, had the reputation of a soothsayer. She would tell people their fortunes, and they would queue up to consult her. And she could tell them not only their future, but also, and that is the significant thing for me, the root of their soul. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to tell somebody the root of their soul. And that is a Kabbalistic expression, because the Kabbalah is where the doctrine of incarnation, transmigration of souls comes into Judaism. So there is a belief that each one of us is in fact an incarnation of lots and lots and lots of people that lived before, right back to the origins of mankind, like the Indian concept of incarnation. There are lots of uncertainty about where it comes from, why, and so on. But anyway, it comes in the late 12th century, in the earliest text we have of the Kabbalah, and becomes a very important Kabbalistic doctrine. Now, people like Isaac Luria in the 16th century, and even before, and many other great Kabbalists later, were credited with the power of looking at a person and being able to see in a visionary way every single early incarnation they had. And they would sometimes tell people, you are a distant incarnation of King Ahab, and you are a distant incarnation of the prophet Samuel, and you are, and they would just say, of somebody called Jacob or Isaac, who lived in such and such a time. And this is a great miraculous power, supernatural power, traditionally credited to great Kabbalistic scholars. I mean, it goes on to be credited in the 18th century. Jonathan Apeshitz, the great Kabbalist who was suspected of Sabbateanism, was credited with this power, and others. People, Kabbalists, it's a tool, you have it as one of your skills. To attribute it to this woman, to say that she could tell people the root of their soul, is an extraordinary statement. That a woman could be credited with this. Inconceivable in any other setting. There is very little doubt that women are prominent, that people living at the time regard this prominence as exceptional, and as in itself evidence of the authenticity of the Messianic message, that the world is in the process of transforming because the redemption has begun. And it continues well after the death of Sabbatai Tzvi in all the later stages of Sabbateanism. The same Abraham Miguel Cardozo, again, we have quite a lot of texts written by him. Some of them are complex theological tracts. Some of them are autobiographical treatises. And he describes how he became convinced of the truth of Sabbateanism. And this was entirely the product of the prophetic experiences of the women in his household. Mm-hmm. That include his wife, his sister-in-law, an elderly relative who was crippled, seriously crippled. She had from birth, she was born a crippled, something, he describes it with a term to do with her leg, which is very difficult to know exactly what it was, but she was limping and couldn't. And miraculously, on the day she first prophesied the Messianic message, her leg was intact, was healed. His little daughter, and he has 2 letters in which his little daughter, I forget her name now, features. She comes and she sits on his lap, and he suddenly notices that there's a halo, there's a light over her head. And she opens her mouth and talks to him revelations. So he is surrounded by women in his household who are having prophetic experiences, which is what convinces him that the message of Sabbatai Tzvi, now dead, was actually real, and the Messianic movement is here, and it is going to happen. And he begins to predict other dates. He believes that in the year 1782, that's when it finally happens. And when this doesn't happen, the way it always works, the date stretches. There's a very well-known study about the phenomenon of Messianic prophecy that fails. When prophecy fails, it was a book published, I think, in the 60s, and has had lots of offshoots subsequently. It always shows you how you cannot believe that when the prophecy proves to be wrong, because it didn't happen, suddenly people would lose their belief. Far from it, there's always the way of continuing, of explaining it away. I wanted to mention also that in the Ashkenazi world, we have fragments of information that strengthen my suspicion that within that phenomenon of women prophesying, the state of unmarried women or virgins is peculiar, particular. And I would say that this is one of the ways in which Sabbateanism deviates from classical rabbinic values, because I was trying to show you earlier on in our previous sessions, particularly in the first one, how there is a built-in rejection, resistance to the idea of women who don't fulfill their material, physical, sexual role, and there's certainly no admiration of the virgin as anything. Here, I think you do. It's never said explicitly. But the prominence of these virgin girls, and that could well be a syncretistic thing, it could well be imported from the Christian surrounding environment, is striking. And I found, which really gave me a lot of pleasure when I stumbled on it, there are 2 elderly female prophetesses, as they are called. And this is in Central Europe, in a territory that is Hungary, between Hungary and the old Czechoslovakia. And these are the 2 daughters of a very well-known rabbi in the region, in Mattersdorf, and his name is Schotting, Aryeh Leib Schotting. And his 2 daughters were known as prophetesses of the Sabbatean movement. And on their tombstones, which were discovered by a man called Greenwald, a scholar who studied the history of the Jews and the cemeteries of that region, he transcribes the tombstones of these 2 women. And they died as old maids. And they're described as that, as unmarried women. They died as old maids. And I am suspicious, I can't prove it, that they were not old maids, they were celibates. That they were women who embraced and we have other evidence for celibacy as one of the other deviations of Sabbateanism in the Polish context. I can't be sure of it, but it is certainly possible to interpret the fact that these two women, famous as Sabbatean prophetesses, died as old maids. I'm saying that because spinsterhood, lifelong spinsterhood in the Jewish community was extremely rare. I mean, there are women who marry late, there's been an exaggeration of the early marriages kind of tradition, which was only possible amongst the very wealthy. Poorer people had to wait much longer. And there are women who are for a while alone because their husbands had died, but they would tend to be remarried, or because they've been abandoned and then they're just tragically, but they're not spinsters. These are lifelong spinsters, which I find intriguing and am tempted to place in the same context, in which the Sabbateans, as part of their eradication of the very rigid gender boundaries that the halachic world has, and the halacha is very gendered, the halacha is very clear about what is for women and what is for men. It is quite enshrined in Jewish law and very robust. And what the Sabbateans seem to be doing, and that is part of the agenda, is to eradicate those boundaries. And in a certain context, I would call them egalitarian. And there is a kind of a revaluation of women, even ontologically. Whereas the tradition, going back to the medieval philosophical language of matter and form and body and soul, where men and women, the genders are differentiated ontologically, and that's why women are for the physical things and men are for the intellect, or men are a mixture, but they are the ones who battle the physical in order to enhance. I think here women are credited with the same access to spiritual forces as men. So this is what I read into it, I think legitimately, but it is arguable. You could say that I'm exaggerating it, but that's my sense. And the sudden emergence of restrictions on sexual life of women, celibacy for women, which is so unusual and so seems to me to suggest something along these lines, even though it is not articulated in those terms as an agenda. I would also mention Eva Frank. Eva Frank, the daughter of Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was perhaps the last incarnation of these redeeming figures in Poland. He was a Polish Jew, born in Podolia, in that territory on the western borders of Poland that were, in fact, during the late 16th century, had been going back and forth between the Ottomans and the Poles, and eventually they become Polish. There was a strong Ottoman influence, Muslim influence there. He was born in the Polish side, but his father, who was a merchant, when he was quite young, moved to Saloniki, to the Ottoman Empire. And so this Polish Jew apparently didn't know Polish. His first language was Judeo-Espanol, was Ladino. And that's why he's called Frank. I mean, the Jews didn't have surnames at that time, but he's called Frank. Frank is Frank. The term by which Sephardi Jews would have called somebody who came from France. I mean, an Ashkenazi. So he's a Frank. Although I know that Frank became the name for Sephardi. And I remember my mother, when I was a child, comforting me or teasing me, saying, never mind, you're a small Frankinia. I'm only half. I have a redeeming Ashkenazi half, but still she used to. It just died me. So he's called Frank because of that. So he was a Polish Jew who actually spent his formative years in an Islamic milieu in Saloniki, which was a big center of those Sabbatean followers who, a small proportion of them, followed Sabbatai Tzvi himself into Islam. When Sabbatai Tzvi suddenly, for no obvious reasons that we know, because there's no sources, converted to Islam. At the height of his fame, he was arrested by the Ottoman authorities because they noticed that there was too much turbulence going on amongst the Jews, and people were stopping trade and selling their houses in anticipation of being miraculously transported to the Holy Land. And so there was suspicion that this is a political thing, and there was too much Holy Land. You know, they were afraid that they were all going to go, so they arrested him. And the conditions of arrest were quite generous, because he was allowed to receive visitors, and during his period of arrest, he had lots of visitors from all over the Jewish world, including Poland, coming to see him and to be honored by seeing him. And one of those, apparently, was instrumental in his conversion. It's not entirely clear. He challenged him on something. He himself then quickly converted, a Polish Jew who came to test him, converted to Islam, went back to Poland to return to Judaism, but Sabbatai Șebí remained a Muslim. And very quickly, the news began to spread that the Messiah had become a Muslim, and you would think that with news like that, everybody would say, oh, well, in that case it was false Messiah. Not a bit of it. Nathan of Gaza, the prophet, was very ingenious and very quick to incorporate Sabbatai Șebí's conversion into his Messianic mission. This is the hardest part of his mission. He portrays Islam in Kabbalistic terms as the kind of the crudest manifestation of matter, which is the root of evil in the cosmos. He had to descend to those lower levels where Islam is in order to redeem from it the elements of divine energy which sustain it. I mean, this is a Kabbalistic notion about how the whole world exists at the moment, in which good and evil are mixed, because at one of the earliest stages of the creation, there was a kind of a mishap. The divine energy, which is described in terms of light, scattered. It burst out of the vessels that were supposed to contain it, and it fell down into the cosmos, where it eventually landed and got mixed up with matter, which is envisaged as if it was kind of sticky black muck, you know, like tar, you know, for the road. So there are holy sparks of divine creative energy that are trapped in the realm of evil. And this is why our world is a constant battle between God and evil. In the Messianic redemption, all these divine elements that are trapped within the husks, as they're called by the Kabbalists, the bottom layer of the chain of emanation, you know, in which evil flourishes, they will be extracted from it, restored to the divine source, and when that happens, they will die of themselves, because it is this divine energy that keeps them alive. Once you take out those holy sparks, they would dwindle away, they would cease to exist, because there would be nothing to animate them. So Nathan of Gaza immediately produces and disseminates letters all over. We know that the propaganda machine was extremely effective, because there are lots of manuscript copies of the letters that were sent, the same letter to lots of different communities, descriptions of how they are read in the synagogue in public, in one synagogue after another. So he explains the apostasy, the conversion to Islam, as the descent of Sabbatai Șebí to the level of Islam in order to release the divine sparks, and that would be the completion of his mission. And so a significant number of the followers, some abandon it, but a very significant proportion, again we don't have numbers, continue. The movement certainly does not die out. You know, if you like, you can compare it to what happened in our own days, or at least those of us who are old enough, with the Chabad-Lubavitch Hasidic movement, when the Rebbe, the last Rebbe, who died in 1994, who was believed by his followers to be the Messiah, and who was bringing up the redemption any minute now, dies. And people were in print, you know, some scholars were in print saying, well, that'll be the end of Chabad-Lubavitch. Far from it, you know, it goes on, and he is believed to be living in some other dimension of being, but there will be a second coming. I mean, you know, the second coming is a Jewish idea. It is a Jewish idea, you from the first time, and it keeps coming. We have the same thing about Nachman of Brasov. We have the same thing about the Baal Shem Tov, even debates about whether he would come back in 16 years or 60 years, because I couldn't read, because in Yiddish, 16 and 60 sound, as in English, almost the same, and the person who records this edition, I wasn't sure whether it was said 60 or 16, but that he would come back, there's no question. Okay, so the movement goes on after the, and Jacob Frank, who is in Saloniki, is being initiated as a Sabbatian by the Salonican Muslim Sabbatins, who maintain, apparently to the present day, and certainly until some point earlier on in the 20th century, a distinctive sectarian identity within Islam. They only marry each other. They're called the Dönma, a term which has lots of different, like Maran, it has lots of different etymologies, but one of them that I was most convinced that it is to do with little fish that go like this, back and forth. At any rate, they are nowadays quite worried. They're the people, to the extent that they survived, that a distinctive sect within Islam, they embraced secularism and Ataturk, the revolution in Turkey, with great enthusiasm, because that was the end of anything that kind of put them in an awkward position as a sect, as a suspected sect. And now that Islam is back, they're actually feeling very uncomfortable. And they were very successful under Ataturk, and secularism enabled them to become very dominant in the professions, in the media, even in the army. And now they're threatened, and some of them have gone back to, and some of them have come to Israel wanting to return to Judaism. So there was a large community of these Muslim Sabbatians in Saloniki, and this is where Jacob Frank got initiated into Sabbatianism. He goes on and travels, he goes to Bukovina, then also under Ottoman rule, and eventually he goes back to Poland in the mid-50s of the 18th century, 1750s. And he's hailed as a great Sabbatian prophet. And the local Polish Sabbatians flock to him and are very inspired by him. And we have interesting descriptions of events surrounding his return to Poland. For example, in the town called Lansko, there is a description from three different sources that kind of more or less corroborate each other, although it's very hostile and it's anti, so always suspect, how the local preacher, a man called Elisha Shaw, who has a daughter, Chaya Shaw, who is a prominent Sabbatian prophetess herself, a son-in-law, a son, they're all the active, the kind of the nucleus of the Sabbatian community in that region. They have a gathering on one Shabbat, and the other people in the community are very intrigued because they lock the house, and all kinds of noises come out of the house. And one young man stays outside and manages to look in through the cracks in presumably it's a wooden house. What he sees horrifies him, because there's Chaya Shaw, the daughter, naked on a table, dancing with the crown of the Torah on her head, and all the men are touching her body, stroking her, dancing around her. And this is kind of inspired by the visit of Jacob Frank in that village. Whether it's true or not in that town, we don't know whether it's true or not. Three different sources, but it could be a rumor that spread and people reproduce. The prominence of Chaya Shaw as a Sabbatian prophetess and her sexual activities is actually recorded in some of the confessions by the Sabbatians who repent. So there's no doubt that she was involved in sexual boundary crossing and transgressions. So Jacob Frank, this is the character. He eventually establishes a court, like a Hasidic Rebbe. He has a court, like a Polish nobleman. I mean, this is where the term comes from, the court, like a royal court, where people go on pilgrimage to him. And the court moves every few years. He was in Ivania, which is still in that area first. He then moves to Moravia, where he has quite a powerful community of supporters, very wealthy. Some of the leading families in Bohemia and Moravia are Sabbatean supporters. And these are families that became ennobled by the Austrian authorities. You know, they were the first Jewish aristocratic families because they were so wealthy and they were lending money and providing goods for the monarchy. So these families, they had the monopoly on tobacco, they had the monopoly on certain provisions for the army. You know, they really were very powerful and they were great Sabbatean supporters. So they invite Jacob Frank, and he establishes his court in Brno, in Brünn, for a few years. And eventually he's invited by an eccentric German, non-Jewish, German aristocrat who is interested in the occult, interested in Kabbalah, interested in things esoteric, fascinated by this character of Jacob Frank, who is quite impressive, quite charismatic, and offers to him free use of one of his palaces just outside Frankfurt, in Offenbach, in a small town called Offenbach, which is now actually almost a suburb of Frankfurt. And this is the last years of... And now, Jacob Frank, at a certain point, engages in a debate with the rabbis. He is so persecuted by the rabbis, who are so embarrassed and horrified by what the rumors about them, by what they're doing. The rabbis are determined to get rid of it. You know, they try to excommunicate, you know, bans of excommunication. The Council of Foreland in Poland issues a proclamation of excommunication. It doesn't help, you know, they're still there. They don't manage to eradicate it. Eventually, and this is the thesis of the man who wrote the most authoritative book about Jacob Frank in recent years, and Pavel Maciejko, he argues, and I think convincingly, that it is the persecution by the rabbis that eventually drives Jacob Frank to Catholicism. You know, he seeks shelter from persecution by the rabbis in the bosom of the church. Now, the church is always very welcoming to Jews who want to convert. Apparently, Jacob Frank promised the Polish clergy that he would bring them thousands of Jews, and he does have a large following. And he publicly converts following a big disputation with the rabbis about the truth of Judaism and Christianity, modeled on the big medieval disputations between the religions in Barcelona with Nachmanides, in Paris, and in Tortosa. So suddenly we have a revival of public disputations. And of course the rabbis are supposed to have lost, and Christianity succeeds. And Jacob Frank is baptized together with about 1,000, some people say several thousand, of his followers twice, once in Kamenets-Podolsk, the town where it is then after another disputation 2 years later in Lvov, they go to Warsaw and they're baptized under the auspices of the king, so they all become Catholics. But the Catholic Church doesn't take a long time to realize that this conversion to Catholicism was far from a straightforward conversion, and in fact Jacob Frank is the Messiah, not Jesus, and that this is a sectarian, heretical group by Catholic standards, and so he's quickly imprisoned. He's imprisoned as a heretic in a town called Częstochowa, which has a monastery. How am I doing? Which is, it's such a, forgive me, I'm going into this story because it is so remarkable, but I'm at risk of going over time. Anyway, so they imprison him in the town of Częstochowa, which has a monastery, Jasna Gora, which is the most famous Catholic pilgrim site in Eastern Europe. You know, it is a place where tens of thousands of people go. And I witnessed it once. I went, you know, and it was extraordinary. I mean, this little town was absolutely inundated by pilgrims. And in the monastery, there is an icon of the Virgin Mary, which is known as the Black Madonna, one of many other Black Madonnas, and she's even scarred. She has, have you ever seen it?
No, but we're, I mean, Jasna Gora, you know what it means.
Yes, I know.
Clear mountain,
course,
so it's like very...
You have places called that as well.
Yeah.
she
and
has.
Black Madonna.
That's why
And
it's
you
such
have
a
Black Madonnas
contrast.
as well.
Yeah.
There are dozens of more Black Madonnas all over the world. There's some in Spain, there's some all over Europe. Anyway, this particular Black Madonna, and I saw her, and she's black simply because the picture is so brown, it's so dark. She has a scar. She is a hero. She was captured and stabbed during the 14th century and has remained unmended, so you can see the scar on her cheek. And at the period in which we are concerned, in the 18th century, she becomes a symbol of Polish patriotism. Mm-hmm. And she is, in the last battle, before the defeat of the last stronghold of Polish military campaign against the invading Russians. She is described as standing on the parapets of the fortress that surrounds Jasna Gora. The monastery is surrounded by fortifications, and she is described as standing and throwing back all the iron, missiles that are being shot at by the Russians on the monastery, and she's catching them and throwing them back on the Russians. She's a great heroine. And of course, it's like all the Polish battles. It is a failure. They are defeated by the Russians. But the Poles arrest him and imprison him in 1760, around very shortly after his conversion and baptism. And he spent 12 years as a prisoner in Częstochowa, but like Sabbatai Czevi under the Ottomans, in wonderful conditions. He has a court inside the monastery. People continue, his devotees come from all over Poland and far, far beyond, with missions from Saloniki and from the Ottoman Muslim Sabbateans to visit him, and he's allowed to. They bring gifts, they bring money, they bring, so he operates, he just can't go away, but he's there in conditions of opulence. And during this period, in 1770, his wife dies. Now, up until that point, he operated as the center of the Messianic cult. He was the redeeming figure, and his wife, like Sabbatai Czevi's wife, I didn't talk much about her, but she is definitely a consort. She is like a royal consort. And she is referred to as the Dama, the lady, the Vila in the Hebrew text, as Sabbatai Czevi's wife Sarah was. And we have fragments of information about her, but it is clear that she had communications with the women followers. There are descriptions of her sending letters, missions to women, but again, fragmentary, still interesting. So, Sabbatai Czevi's wife, Hanale, who came from Bulgaria, from Ottoman Bulgaria, and was an Ottoman Sephardi, was treated as the Dama, as the lady, his consort, and he's involved in some of the rituals. They kind of are like the royal couple. But when she dies, he shifts attention to his daughter Eva, who is at that time no longer that young, and she gradually, in his thought, begins to emerge as the Messiah. And he begins to articulate a very strange and aggressive message about Sabbatai Czevi and all the other preceding potential messiahs in the history of the Jewish people. From Adam, who according to the Midrash was potentially a redeemer. At one point it looked like all you need is to create one human being and then the world will be redeemed. But lo and behold, Adam sinned. He ate of the apple, so you have the whole human history with lots of different redemptive figures from Moses through David, through Hezekiah. You have a whole gallery of them. All of them, he says, failed. And it is natural that they failed. Of course they failed for the simple reason that they were men. He says, the soul of the Messiah, according to the Kabbalah it is true, originates in that level of the divine being that is the feminine level. It is the Sphira Malchut, the last Sphira. That is where the soul of the Messiah originates. All souls originates in God, and this belongs in that 10th level. So he says, in a very simplistic way, and he is on the whole quite crude and simplistic, he's not a sophisticated thinker, he's very crass. He says, well, of course, the soul of the Messiah must be embodied in a woman. It cannot be embodied in the man, and that was why all these previous potential redeemers have failed, including Sabbatai Tzvi, of whom he is very critical. He says of Sabbatai Tzvi came very near. He was a man who was almost a woman, he says. And we don't know, that is not impossible, that this statement can be linked with rumors that are recorded, but they could be just hostile accounts, that Sabbatai Tzvi, like many other Jews in the Ottoman Empire, was, according to one witness, witnessed having a homosexual act. So we know there are studies now about the prevalence of homosexuality within the Jewish community of the Ottoman Empire, like anywhere else in the Muslim world. And it was within marriage. People married and had families and children, and for fun, they had homosexual relations. So it's not impossible that this is an echo of rumors about Sabbatai Tzvi's homosexuality, or it could be just Kabbalistic. He came near to being a woman, but he wasn't quite. He was a man. He also is quite interestingly critical of Islam. He grades the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, hierarchically. He says, Islam, which is the religion he chose to convert to, is the worst of them. Why? Because in Islam there's no room for women. They hide them away. They cover them from top to toe. You don't hear women, you don't see of women. This is a society where women are out. Judaism is a little better, but not much more. The Kabbalists, he says, they know the importance of woman. And he means the Kabbalistic, huge literature and imagery that focuses on the female aspect of the Godhead, the Shekhinah. This is unique to the Kabbalah. It really expends more pages of Kabbalistic texts are about the female aspects of God than about any other aspect of God. She is really the heroine of all the dynamics within the divine world, even though she is hierarchically the lowest. So he says, what the Jews know, the Kabbalists whisper about women. Kabbalah is esoteric. Kabbalah is not the official kind of face of Judaism. So they only whisper. You can't see her. You can't deal with her. They only whisper about her. The reason why I took you into Christianity, which I'm sure is not the real reason historically why he and his followers converted, is that Christianity is the best of the three religions, because there the Virgin Mary is even more important than her son. And this is a correct observation when you look at the kind of the devotional life of Catholic Christians, where the Virgin Mary really is the central figure. She is the mediator. She is the one to whom one prays. And to live in Czestochowa and witness the cult of the Virgin Mary, no doubt colored his opinion of Catholicism. He could see that this was the crucial. So Christianity is the best religion. I took you there into Christianity because it brings you closer to the female Messiah, the true redemptive figure who must be a woman. However, he says, the Virgin Mary is only the outer shell, the skin, that covers the fruit. One has to go through the shell in order to get into the real fruit, and this is an image that Nathan of Gaza uses of Sabbatai Tzvi in relation to Jesus. He says Jesus was like the outer shell. You had to recognize that within it lies the real fruit, which is Sabbatai Tzvi. So he applies this to the female, and he in fact gradually develops a notion of his daughter Eva, the virgin who was never married, as the true Messiah. There's something strange about that, because it is clear from the little we can see or hear of Eva herself that she was not made for it. She did not have her father's charismatic powers. And she very likely was just an ordinary girl. We have a picture. This is Eva. She's supposed to be very beautiful, which is not entirely borne out by this picture. This is one of the miniatures that we know from the text. Jacob Frank commissioned by artists to paint of his daughter, and some of them were decorated, as we have in the scripture, like icons. So he was making icons of his daughter that were modeled on the icons of the Virgin Mary. And this was found only relatively recently. I am grateful to Pavel, who discovered it in the Warsaw Museum, after it was reported and even drawn by some scholars before the war, and then considered lost after the Second World War. And I knew Arthur Green, Art Green, I don't know if you know, he's a Kabbalistic scholar, an American, a bit older than me even. He is known, he has a fascination with European flea markets, and he collects glass, and he has been going to Europe year after year, looking in all these places in the hope of coming across one of these, which he never did. Yeah. And then Pavel found it that actually it was unrecognized, but in the Warsaw Museum, and that's what. So I owe the title page of my book to him. So Eva Frank becomes the Messianic figurehead without actually having the talent for it. There are all kinds of descriptions of her really being treated like a great, noble European woman, learning to entertain the lords who came to visit her. And after the death of the father in 1791, she, for the rest of her life, she dies in 1816, she becomes the Messiah, but you can see that she's not suited for it because the court begins to decline and people stop bringing money, and so on. She dies in debt. We have documents recording her debts to the Offenbach butchers, her debts to the Offenbach carpenters. She was behaving like a princess and ordering all these things in this palace but her following was dwindling and money was running out. She was entirely dependent on gifts brought by the followers, which in the days of her father flowed in, particularly the wealthy families that supported him, and she didn't. Anyway, the idea of a female Messiah is Jacob Frank's, and it is a stage in the development of his thought. It begins, as far as I was able to reconstruct it, following shortly after the death of her mother, and it is a kind of a transformation of his sense of himself as the powerful redemptive figure, as the one who facilitates, the one who presents, the one who makes it possible for the redemption to take place by this woman. Okay, I'll leave this. I just wanted to, I got to speaking about her because she, again, is a virgin, another virgin, who significantly is never married, and strengthens my suspicion that this is a deliberate thing. I'm going to have to start winding up, so I have to skip so much of it. Do read this book if you're interested, because I don't have time to go through all the material that I would enjoy presenting before you. I would just say, to wind up what I have to say, two more general observations about which I think are what made possible this emergence of women on the forefront of the Messianic arena during this period. One is, and one of them is incidental, and I'll come finally, we'll conclude with this text. So these are both incidental. They're not the agenda. They are collateral benefits. They are the result of things that were happening in Sabbateanism that made it possible. One is a very clear shift that Nathan of Gaza stresses from the very beginning of prophesying Sabbatai Tzvi's messiahship. Shift away from the traditional Jewish reward and punishment mechanism for salvation. In Jewish religion, you are judged by your deeds. this is why Judaism is portrayed already in the New Testament as a carnal religion, it is a religion of doing. Faith doesn't come into it, it doesn't matter what you think, so long as you do the things you're supposed to do, you're fine. You would earn your salvation, you would earn your seat in the world to come. Nathan of Gaza, interestingly, and it has been speculated on possible Christian influence here, explicitly says, time and again, that what determines your future redemption is your faith. And by faith, he means faith in Messiahship of Sabbatai Tzvi. He says explicitly, it doesn't matter how many sins you have committed, how many mitzvot, how many commandments you have transgressed. If you have faith in the Messiah, you have secured your place in the world to come. And conversely, even if you are the most meticulously observant Jew, and you have fulfilled every commandment exactly as it should throughout your life, if you have no faith in Sabbatai Tzvi Messiahship, you will not, you will burn in hell. You will not get salvation. And this is reiterated by other Sabbatian prophets later on, right through. So this is one of the dominant orientations of Sabbatianism from the beginning, which is intriguing. It is very Christian. Sholem, who observed it, of course, was not inclined to attribute anything to Christian influence. He was much more comfortable with showing it to be an immanent Jewish development. Other scholars are much more open to, and he was doing that possibly as a reaction against a long 19th century tradition of dismissing Kabbalah and anything kind of as Christian influence or as non-Jewish influence on the kind of outer periphery of rabbinic Judaism. So he wanted to bring it back to the center to show that Kabbalah is really at the heart of rabbinic tradition. And he was therefore, on the whole, even though he was better equipped than most to detect such proximities and influences, he was very careful about that. So he points out the similarity, he says it's analogous, he hasn't found any evidence of direct Christian influence there. We don't know, but it is true. Now I say that it is that shift that has opened the way for a much more egalitarian position, because whereas the halakha, as I said just before, is very gendered. This is what women do, this is what men do. And the women do very little and the men do a lot when it comes to commandments. So women, by nature of the halakha, are very much on the margins of religious active life, of active participation in religious life. But once the mitzvot are not the overriding criterion for salvation, for faith, there was never in Judaism a mechanism for gendering faith. Men, like women, like any, can have faith in exactly the same way, as much or as little as each other. It has never featured as anything that you could either gender or even measure, in any significant way. So that incidentally opens the way for more prominence, more greater activism, active involvement by women. And the other incidental or opening that Sabbatianism caused, that is not part of its explicit agenda, is the obliteration of the blurring of gender boundaries that is inherent in it from the start, that comes from the belief that we are now living in Messianic time, and the old Torah and all its halachic prohibitions is obsolete, because we are we're receiving a new Torah. And the new Torah, in Kabbalistic terms, is a Torah that comes not from the tree of knowledge, but from the tree of life, using the imagery of Genesis. The tree of knowledge is, in its full name, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it is the Torah of separation between good and evil. Do this because it is good, don't do that because it is evil. So that is short term for the whole halakha. It is a set of laws that is designed to separate good from evil. Whereas the tree of life, according to the Kabbalists, comes from a higher domain which transcends all distinctions and separations, in which there's no longer any distinction between good and evil, because everything is pure spirituality, pure good. So once your Torah has transcended the world of prohibitions, the world of halakha, then the women can play as active a part in the cult as the men. They're no longer relegated to their mitzvot. And remember that the Sabbateans transgressed the commandments by virtue of this notion that the commandments are now obsolete, not indiscriminately. They didn't start murdering people, and they didn't start stealing or transgressing the moral negative commandments. Most of their transgressions were to do with the body, either sex or food. So not fasting on Yom Kippur. There's no longer any need to, because we are all, beyond this judgment by deed. Not fasting on the day that commemorates the destruction of the temple, because the temple is being rebuilt. Eating on Yom Kippur, smoking on Shabbat. So these are the pleasures of the body that are now permissible. The one thing that shows you that this was done not out of some kind of unrestrained sexual and food appetites that have been released, but ritually is the way to transgress the prohibition on forbidden fat of the animal. To kosher an animal, there are certain parts of the fat that are not to be eaten. They're called chaylev. They ate it from candles, not from animals. They don't cook, bacon fat. They shaved bits of what candles were made of at that time, which was animal fat, and you eat it ritually as a declaration of your allegiance to Sabbatianism, and you are doing it as a mitzvah. You are performing a mitzvah. You are showing that the old prohibition is null and void. So this is actually very unpleasant, but it is a transgression that is ritually performed in order to indicate this. So when you go beyond the mitzvot and beyond all the prohibitions and beyond all the positive commandments that are only men's and not women's, then women, certainly women can participate just as much as men in eating on Yom Kippur and on having sex with forbidden partners, and in fact very often they are described as leading it. When it comes to the kitchen, the women are cooking the meals for Yom Kippur, and the women are orchestrating the transgressions that are to do with the body, which is their domain. So that too becomes an incidental, egalitarian platform that enables women to move from the periphery to the center, to be at the forefront of the Messianic movement. Now, but I also insist that there's also an agenda, which, as I said at the very beginning, is not consistently implemented, is patchy evidence for, but I want you to see its first expression in the words as recorded by Thomas Kuhnen, this Dutch clergyman. So if you have the text in front of you, let's look at it. And I also, on the same page, you have Sholom's reaction to it. And I'll say something about Sholom's reaction, and with that I'll conclude. So, as for you, wretched women, great is your memory, for on Eve's account you suffer agonies in childbirth. What is more, you are in bondage to your husband, and can do nothing, small or great, without their consent, and so on and so forth. Give thanks to God, then, that I have come to the world to redeem you from all your sufferings, to liberate you, and to make you as happy as your husbands, for I have come to annul the sin of Adam. As you can see from Sholom, I won't read Sholom, but you can read it for yourself. Sholom, who records this, can't help being surprised by it. Where on earth does a 17th century Izmir Jew come up with these ideas? It is an extraordinary statement for a man in his time and place. I mean, I have about 150 pages there in which I try to explain where he gets it from, or where he might have got it from, and what might have encouraged it. And this includes his readings of the Zohar. There are certain passages in the Zohar which describe this upside-down world that we spoke about last time, where things are exactly the opposite as they are. So women who are at the moment not allowed to study and not allowed to pray like the men, what do they do in the Messianic or in the eschatological future? They do exactly what they're not allowed to do. They study, not just study ordinary Talmud, they study Ta'amei HaMitzvot, they study the most obscure and abstruse and difficult, intellectually and potentially dangerous explanations of the mitzvot that the Kabbalists have. And they pray all day. No mention of children, no mention of kitchen, no mention of sex. They are segregated in a heaven that is entirely for them, and that no man is allowed to look into, not even angels look into. So passages like that can trigger the imagination. If we are now living in the eschatological future, then it's possible that that is a stimulus. He also, the other Kabbalistic book he studied is Sefer HaKana, which is an anonymous book attributed to a Tanaitic sage. Now we think probably written somewhere in the Byzantine, pre-Ottoman Empire, maybe in the 14th century, but clearly Kabbalistic. It used to be thought to be Spanish, but I think current opinion it is not. And that book has a very long and angry attack, ostensibly, on the logic of rabbinic halakha. I mean, in the end, it is a very conservative book, and it uses a dialogue between a teacher and a pupil, and the pupil offers all these criticisms of the logic of halakha, which is perverse, and the teacher resolves them in Kabbalistic terms. And one of the points that the pupil time and again raises is, why does halakha discriminate women against women in this way? Why does it exclude them from this? Why does it stop them from studying? If they don't know the theology, how can they be prevented from transgressing and sinning? You know, very angry, as it were, protests about the misogynistic and discriminatory texture of rabbinic law. And the teacher resolves his questions by offering Kabbalistic explanations. Now, there's no question that the book ultimately is even stricter in its discrimination in Kabbalistic terms than the halakha without the Kabbalistic layer of interpretation. But it raises the issues, it makes them very prominent. And books sometimes can have the effect of the opposite of their intention by highlighting certain issues. And there's a very intelligent paper about that book by Talia Fishman in Philadelphia, who rightly pointed out this point, that, you know, no matter what the ultimate aim of the author is, the very fact that unusually these complaints about the discriminatory practices that result from the logic of Jewish law is enough to open one's mind to this as a question that otherwise would not have. And on top of that, I suggest that there's something about the predominantly Sephardi milieu in which he grew up, which is very migratory, very unstable, lots of family changes. You know, we know that there were, because of the move, not directly necessarily from Iberia, but even within the Ottoman Empire, there was constant movement of the Sephardi communities. Families broke up, there were women suddenly on their own, new marriages that were not halachically legal, you know, women who had been abandoned or whose husbands may have stayed and they moved on their own, or vice versa. So it was a very unstable society in which lots of conflicting practices, different practices merge also, because there were people coming from lots of different places. So that is a more conducive setting historically for such ideas perhaps to take root than a very stable traditional society where everybody knows their place and what they're doing. Plus the importance perhaps that lasts of the conversos, and these are former conversos, in maintaining allegiance to Jewish religion, which puts them in a much more central position than they had been before. Whereas we have all this about the activity, thanks to the Inquisition files, about the situation in Iberia itself. There's less of it available for what happens to the Sephardi diaspora in the part of the world in which they are, although some of the Inquisition files are much later than the period in which we are concerned. But it may well be that starts something, that women are suddenly much more able to be imagined as religious activists, which would not have been possible before. There's so much more that I haven't told you, which is interesting and fascinating, so you can read it. And I wonder, in the little time that I've already exceeded, if there are any questions or suggestions or... Yes, yeah.
Well, I have a couple of, perhaps I didn't understand something well, but I was wondering, considering the attitude that Šabbetay Tzvi had towards women, did that influence the fact that there were more women in the movement than men, or was that the case?
That he clearly loves women. He's interested in women and loves women and surrounds himself with women. There are stories about 70 virgins brought to him by his followers at his request, and he writes to Nathan of Gaza to assure him that he hasn't touched any one of them, but they're there, And this could be something to do with the 70 virgins that the Muslim tradition has. It's not clear where it comes from. But he also maintains a very civil relationship with his two divorced first wives, annulled first wives, which is forbidden by Jewish law. Once you are divorced from a woman, you should not have any contact with them, and he is, And there are descriptions of women flocking to him. He was obviously very attractive, very charismatic, and he was... So I think, yes, his personality and his statements like this speech would have attracted women. And this, we have evidence of women joining Jacob Frank's camp, independently of their husbands, unheard of otherwise. Women who left their husbands in order to join Jacob Frank's cause. A Polish Jew, Jakob Galiński, complains that his wife packed up and just left in order to join. So, and there are descriptions in the chronicles of Jacob Frank's sectarian followers, which survive in Polish, describing groups of women arriving to join them. Groups of women. Jacob Emden, one of the anti-Sabbateans who complains and attacks them, points out all the time, these women, he names women heretics. I've even been driven, and I'm going to give a paper about this next month. I have a footnote about this here. There is a very interesting difference between the way people are excommunicated, before and during the Sabbatean period. Even though the traditional text of the excommunication, the Cherem, has built into it Kol Bar or Bat Yisrael. This is Cherem Kolbo, the 13th century text, which is the basis for all the severe bans of excommunication, including Spinoza's. So, any man or woman of Israel. But if you look at histories of Jewish law, this was very rarely, women very rarely feature as objects of excommunication. Men are. And when it comes to the early modern period, where you begin for the first time to have groups of people collectively being excommunicated, it's only the masculine, it's only men, they don't mention women. Extraordinarily, in the case of the Sabbateans, the bans that we have specify, and their women, they and their women. And we have indeed names of individual women who are independently joining the Sabbatean camp. I compared it to less than, a relatively short period after the big bans against Jacob Frank and his followers are issued by the rabbis. We have bans of excommunication against the Hasidic movement, again collectively, the whole. And there, once again, no mention of women, only the men. So I think it was, even from that you can learn how particularly how unique this episode is, and I think attraction, I didn't speak about it, but I have some material about it, little bits of evidence about the wife of Jacob Frank, for example. Her father, according to one tradition, back in Nikopol, is hearing rumors about his son-in-law, Jacob Frank, and he shows him as a fellow Sabbatean that he does all kinds of strange and horrible things, even as a Sabbatean. So he writes to his daughter and advises her to divorce him and to return home. And the woman refuses. She doesn't want to. And there's no doubt that she refuses because she feels very empowered by her position as the Dama, the lady of the court, who is credited with supernatural powers. Her position is much improved, both spiritually and socially. You know, she's treated as a queen, and people listen to what she says, and she has powers that she didn't have before. Little glimmers of evidence that women actually enjoy this empowerment and are due to.
Well, speaking about Jacob Frank, I just wanted to clear up if I did understand well. Did you say that even when he converted to Catholicism and was in prison, people still kept going?
Yeah.
So even
absolutely.
Okay.
You see, he had a model. Sabbatai Tzvi had been imprisoned and continued to receive people, and with him, interestingly, amongst his followers, there were, we don't know how many, between 1,000 and I would say maybe 2,000 or 3,000 converted to Catholicism with him. But there were also large numbers of Sabbateans, like all the ones in Bohemia, Moravia, didn't convert. They remained Jewish, and they kept their Sabbateanism as secret as they could. Occasionally they would be exposed and criticized. Jacob Emden was very good at exposing. But they remained Jewish. And so there was a mixture of converts and non-converts. From his teaching, we have a huge collection of his dicta, the words of the Lord, which have survived in Polish. There's some debate about what language they were originally said. He may have learned Polish over the years, because when he first returned to Poland, he clearly couldn't speak Polish. He might have known a few words. He spoke Ladino. That was his language. He maybe picked up some Turkish. I don't know, but certainly didn't know. But after living there for a long time, and 12 years in Częstochowa, when he was in prison, he probably learned some. So it's difficult to imagine that that would be a natural language for him to express himself. But we know that most of the people who recorded, who were responsible for preserving his dicta, were his Polish followers. So Szmeruk, for example, Chone Szmeruk, the great Yiddishist, argued to the end of his life that the original language is bound to have been Yiddish.
Wow.
And and he kind of tried to prove it from a few expressions in Yiddish that appear, or a few Hebrew terms that are pronounced like the Ashkenazi, Ashkenazi Hebrew. But we have no stronger evidence that he knew Yiddish anymore. It's possible, but we don't know. The Polish scholars who published an edition of this, Jan Doktor, and even Pavel, when I spoke to him, he's not 100% sure, but he's more inclined to Polish being the original language. That it was the language in which the most of the Polish followers operated, and secondly, the second generation who were already born baptized, that's clear that they didn't have any Yiddish, and they didn't have any Hebrew, and they probably wrote, we don't know. Anyway, from these statements by Jacob Frank himself, I've forgotten now why I was mentioning this collection. What was the question before? What did we do? This is old age. I've lost my thread. This collection, why did I mention the words of the Lord on the question of women being attracted?
No, I asked whether people still went to see him after he converted.
Thank you, yes. So you have the picture as I imagine it, there's a crowd of people listening to him. It's a mixture of converts and non-converts. From what he says, many times in this collection, you can see that quite a lot of them, whether they were baptized or not, they were actually very uncomfortable with the transgressions they had to perform. So he tells them off. You stupid men, he said. What did I take you into Christianity for? You go on fasting on Yom Kippur. You keep the Sabbath, don't you have any sense? He tells them all. You can see that the first generation was still, they were now Catholics, but they were very ill at ease with it, and were constantly slipping back to Jewish practice. And those who were Jewish, who remained Jewish, are transgressing but having to hide it, in their own communities.
Yeah. And the last thing, if I may.
No, I'm grateful for these questions, yeah.
Well, I'm not going to be next time, so. No, I just wanted to mention that even though at the beginning of the 19th century the movement starts decaying gradually, there is a very interesting information that appears in one of the stories written by Chaim Davicho, a Sephardic Jew from Belgrade, that he was born in the middle of the 19th century, and when he starts writing tales about the Sephardic community, he somehow encompasses the period from the middle of the 19th towards the end.
Yeah.
And he said that he remembers when he was a child, the community of Sephardim in Belgrade lived next to the river Danube. He said suddenly this big machine appeared on the Danube, breaking through the fog, and it was a steamboat, and it was something very new for the Sephardim. So they believed that it was Shabbatai Tzvi coming. So they don't say a Messiah, just use like a general term to say, they say specifically Shabbatai Tzvi. It could be like he might be coming back. I want to just do.
That's very nice to know. Yeah.
Now I'm going to shut up.
Anyone else?
Was it not a conflict for those Sabbatian Jews who had not converted to share, to keep on joining the community when so many of them
it was, and we have some pieces of evidence about it. There's one man who belongs to one of the Prague aristocracy of Jews. I mean, the family had been von Königsberg. They were ennobled by the Austrian authorities, who was born. He was educated first of all like a muscular, already in the middle of the 18th century. So he's taught philosophy, he's taught German, he's taught grammar, Hebrew grammar, but he's not taught rabbinics at all. And then he is married into another Sabbath, and he comes from a family that had been Sabbatian for 2 generations before, and he's married into one of these families, and his father-in-law, Yona Werner, is the dominant figure of the circle of Sabbatians in Prague. And the two of them become very close. There's an age gap of about 20 years between them. And we have descriptions of them studying together. And so we have the younger from Königsberg teaching his father-in-law philosophy. A little repertoire of kind of European enlightenment and Haskalah. And then we have the older father-in-law teaching him Sabbatian Kabbalah, initiating him as a Kabbalist. And then he authored, I think he is the author, 2 enormous manuscripts of Sabbatian commentaries on different biblical books, assembled all kinds of correspondence with other Sabbatians. It is a treasure trove of material. And he also wrote a complaint to the head of the police of Prague, in which he doesn't say that he's a Sabbatian, but he offers himself as an enlightened and civilized individual, part of the modern world, who is being persecuted by the obscurantist rabbis of the town, as if what he's being persecuted, we know that what he was persecuted for was actually for his Sabbatian affiliation, but there's tension in the community between these elite group, very wealthy, very influential in the community, who are secret Sabbatians, and the other members of the community who are, inclined to criticize and are very frightened, and they are mobilizing the Prague authorities to their side, to accuse the rabbinic obscurantists for. There are clearly tensions between the Sabbatean affiliation and their membership of the Jewish community. And when they go to visit Offenbach, and in the case of the evidence we have from the one member of the Prague community, also of that group, who is sent there as a teenager, he's 17, I think, when he goes, and he's too late, he just misses Jacob Frank, who had died, but he sees Emma Frank. And he is quite appalled by the experience, even though he's been indoctrinated in Sabbatean beliefs and is looking forward to this event as something that would completely transform his world. And then he writes of his disappointment. She didn't even look at me, I bowed down, and then they all mumble-jumbled all kinds of things, and it was, he clearly is an intelligent young man who is not impressed by what he sees. And yet he comes back and remains a member of that community. So there are tensions, but they kind of negotiate these.
My question is the descriptions of these women transgressing or whatever they're doing. I mean, these women voices. In which languages do we have them?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's an interesting
so
question,
complex,
of course.
Right?
So now we are told that in this phenomenon of mass prophecy, when all these women, hundreds of women, are saying things that they then don't know that they've said, they're speaking in either beautiful Hebrew, or in some cases we are told that they are offering fresh divine revelations in Aramaic, the language of the Zohar, a language they don't know. And Jacob Emden even writes in one case that people are sitting around and writing down these revelations. So they are miraculously supposed to know the languages they don't know. The sad fact is that we don't, if indeed people were writing down new revelations by these female prophets, then we might have had some female prophets who are not just hysterical, but maybe theologians, maybe articulate prophets like Nathan of Gaza or Cardozo. We don't have a single page that could be attributed, but at the same time one has to remember that quite a few Sabbatean texts are anonymous, and that was a measure of caution that they often, they don't sign the writings because it was dangerous. Who knows? Maybe some of the texts we have were written by these women. We don't know. We know about, and I didn't have time to describe it, that the Sabbateans clearly had an agenda of educating women in the language of the Zohar. Educating Zohar, classes of Zohar for women. In Prague, there are descriptions of men and women studying Zohar together. In some of the German towns, there's one man, Moshe David Podheitz, who is a Sabbatean prophet himself, and he goes to rich Jewish households to teach the girls in the household Zohar in private lessons. And you can imagine what Jacob Emden has to say about what went on during those lessons. But he is officially their tutor in Zohar. And there are statements by Cardozo and by others about the need to teach Zohar to everyone, especially to women. And if they don't know the language of the Zohar, let them study it Bil'azan. And we know that during this period we already have a Yiddish translation of selections from the Zohar, Nachalat Tsevi, by an Ashkenazi Jew, and we have some Ladino translations of the Zohar. And so one teaches women the Zohar in their own language, if they can't be taught it in the original Aramaic.
Super interesting. And in general, also about Sabbateans and also about the movement of Jacob Frank. I mean, the the documents, I suppose they're also in Polish and in Hebrew and what else? German?
Well, for Sabbateanism, the documents that we have emanating from them are mostly Polish, and we have some in Hebrew as well. And for the Oriental and Sephardi world, again we have Hebrew, we have some Spanish.
Stories.
Yeah. Let me think. Do we have any? Yeah, we have poetry. Collections of hymns, Sabbatean hymns, that are predominantly Hebrew, but include the one volume that has been published many years ago, in the 50s. You know it, Shi'ot V'Tishbachot Shlama. They're predominantly Hebrew, but there are a few in Judeo-Espanol. And then there's another collection that hasn't been published, which is even bigger, that Paul Fenton has published a bit of and written about, where there are quite a lot of Turkish, Judeo-Turkish, and Turkish in Arabic script still. So we have a melange of languages where,
I have
Yes,
a short question regarding transmission of souls.
Transmission of what?
Souls.
Souls. Oh, transmigration of souls. Yeah. Yeah.
Jacob Frank considered that his soul is that of Şabbetay Șebí.
He doesn't say that explicitly. That's a nice question also. The relationship between the two of them, it's clearly something that troubles him and is problematic. He actually never says that he doesn't use the language of Gilgul. He's not really a Kabbalist. He has another agenda, and he says he's against all books. All the laws and all the books have to be destroyed. He says, and I've got a chapter in the book in which I try to put that in the context of his contact with Russian Orthodox sectarians who were fleeing from Russia to Poland because they were being persecuted there. These are the kind of the most radical sects of the Raskol, the split that occurred in Russia in the middle of the 17th century. And some of them have peculiar practices, including very prominent women, which are very reminiscent of some of the things Jacob Frank does and says. One of them is, he almost says word for word, one of the leaders of one of these groups said, Danilo Filipov said, pile up all the old books on a cart and dump them in the Danube, he says. And Jacob Frank says exactly the same. All the books should be put on a cart and dumped in the river, wiped out by the water. Books are finished. He uses the same language as they do. We are teaching you the law of life, not the law of books. He's a very anti-book, even though he says, about the Zohar, he says, including the Zohar. Although I confess, he says, there are certain parts of the Zohar that I rather like. So he clearly read Zohar. Any occasion you can see he's quoting from the Zohar. He has things. So transmigration doesn't feature in his ideas as a Kabbalistic idea, but his relationship with Sabbatai Tzvi and with a man who was the leader of the Saloniki Muslim Sabbateans who had converted in the early 18th century, another group. And the leader of them was Berechia or Baruch, or his name survives in a variety of ways. He refers to both of them as Sabbatai Tzvi, the first and the second. So Sabbatai Tzvi was the first, and these are the mistakes he made, and then the second made the same mistakes because they were all stuck in Islam, He is the one who is going to supersede them, and implicitly, although he doesn't refer to himself as a third, he is the culmination of these two earlier failures within the Sabbatean tradition. But he doesn't talk about transmigration. Nathan of Gaza does, but also, in the writings of the others who are much more Kabbalistically informed and much more literate. Jacob Frank described himself, I'm a Prostak Jew. A Prostak is the Polish Jew for a simple man. Yeah. I'm a peasant.
It's the same.
It's the same, also. And interestingly, Nachman of Bratslav says the same.
Also,
The beginning of my friendship with Chava Tomyansky is this question about how prominent the word Prostak in Yiddish is. I mean, would one use that term without the association of Jacob Frank, which apparently one would. Because when I first saw it, I thought, my God, he's quoting Jacob Frank. So Jacob Frank expresses himself in a much less literate and sophisticated way, but very powerful. He's got a very strong mythical imagination, and some of the imagery he creates is very striking and bewildering, but not a systematic thinker and certainly not holistically sophisticated.
I've got another question.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Did Jacob Frank have other children apart from
Yes,
him?
yes, again, I should have mentioned it, thank you. He had 3 children. He had 2 sons, Joseph and Rochus, interesting one, Joseph and Rochus. Of course, the polemicists, anti-Frankists, call him Ruach. Ruach in the sense of wind, hot air, but it's Rochus. And they are clearly weak compared to the position of Eva in that. So after the death of Jacob Frank in 1791, which the 3 of them tried to hide from the followers, apparently the carriage that used to take him ceremoniously to church every Sunday, surrounded by his army of Amazons, the women, armed women, who paraded in front of him, very exotic sight in Offenbach, and the newspapers from the region describe it. They apparently continued this parade after he was dead, with some figure, shady figure inside the carriage to give the impression that he was still there, or so the newspaper says. But they were in charge of the court, the 3 of them, with Eva as the focus, and all the pilgrims went to see her, but they were running the affairs. And there's one testimony by this young man from Prague who is then disappointed when I said he comes back, and he comes to be very unhappy. He's quite shocked that he's there. He was there for almost a year before he fled. He fled because apparently to leave was punished. If they were caught, they would be flogged, So it's a bit like a cult today, when it's difficult to leave. He fled with another friend. He describes the events of one Yom Kippur when the niece of the prophetess, one of the famous prophetesses that I mentioned, she had a niece who was also described as having prophetic powers and prophetic revelations. She was a young girl and staying at the court during that period, and on Yom Kippur, one of the brothers, I think it was Ruchus, summoned her to the room alone. She was a virgin girl. He put 2 armed guards outside the door and said not to interrupt what was going on. And this is during a period when the court had been running on purely celibate terms. I forgot to say that, to strengthen the attraction of celibacy. This was determined apparently by Jacob Frank. There are no longer any marriages, another thing that links into the Russian Orthodox sects, abolition of marriages. For them it was because there was no longer, they didn't recognize the Orthodox priesthood. And so if there's no priest, there's no sacrament, there's no marriage. For him it was no more marriages, celibacy until the redemption is completed. So the men and the women lived in the court, but very segregated, no sex. People were asked to confess if they had young men, if they had erotic dreams. They were asked every morning publicly to confess them, and they would be flogged for them. So in this ascetic setup, when men and women are segregated, doing everything the same and together, but living separately and no sex, Ruchus has this young girl brought to his room for the whole day, 2 guards outside the door, and when the girl finally comes, she's weeping copiously. And she doesn't say what had happened to her, but it's very clear to us, the readers, and to the young man recording this, what he thought was happening. So this was a ritual transgression on Yom Kippur with a virgin. During the celibacy reign, you do have to have a sexual transgression, because that is the new law, that is the kind of the way of restoring the world to perfection, by ritually enacting the opposite of what the law says.
If I may continue,
Please.
My question was related to this thought that I had, that did the weakness of these 2 songs that Jacob Frank had, could it be a reason for him to choose
The
Eva?
daughter. It's difficult to tell. It's possible. Although, yeah, it's possible because by the time Eva emerges, the two sons are old enough for him to know enough about what they're like. But that's never overt. If that is a psychological, a consideration, thank you, because it's one I haven't considered. It's possible. He certainly links it to his, and it is tempting to link it to his encounter with the cult of the Virgin Mary and the proximity of the icon and the centrality of the female in the Christian worship. And that's the language in which he refers to it. But you may be right, and he may have, preferred, and on the other hand, he's such an ego, he's such a self. He may not have wanted male heirs, he may have been
to substitute the wife. I mean,
the wife it's definitely a substitution of the wife, and a much grander substitution, because the wife never was construed as a Messianic figure. She was his consort, his companion, very submissive to him, and he was clearly an abuser. I mean, there's some description. One description in the Frankist sources, which confirms the most outlandish rumors about sexual transgressions, is a ritual. The whole community on that occasion, or the whole group of them who were there, go down to the basement, which is lit by candles. There's some strange symbols there, including a cross, and not clear exactly what goes on, but at a certain moment the lights are turned off, the candles are switched off, and they all have sex together. They have an orgy. And this is something that has comparabilities in reports about what the Salonican Muslim community of converts was doing, and it is also associated with the Bektashi Muslim sect, which has been often not only compared to the Dharma, but we also know of some contacts, between them. Yeah. And, there is a group, I've read as much as I could about the Bektashis at the time when I was working about this, and to see what the context there could be. And it is very, very clear that, as in the case of some of the great heresies of the Middle Ages, the heresy of the free spirit, that has been written a lot about, rumors of sexual, fantastic transgressions always are present. And it is very difficult to know how much truth there is in them, to what extent they're just what people were trying to, hunting them down, would invent. And there is a school of scholars based in Paris, Guy Vincent and a woman, I forget her name now, who have been writing a lot of scholarly articles about the Bektashis, that's their field, saying that all these are false accusations, that in fact they're very moral, and this is just what the people who don't like sectarian groups would say. So I don't know, I can't gauge it for myself. But what is clear is that for the Bektashi, from the very beginning of the Bektashi tradition, as far as I could tell, Haji Bektesh, who was the founder at some point, not the 13th century, 14th century, had his choice student was a woman, and he had, and the whole Bektashi sect is unique in the Muslim Sufi world in that the women are equal to the men, and they're not veiled, they participate actively in all their rituals, so it's possible that there's supporting influence from there as well, but it is also the case with some of these Russian Orthodox sectarians, the Chilisti, the Dukhobors, the Skopti, the Talmiti, who do all kinds of strange things. The Skopti castrate all the men and cut off the breasts of the women. And there's still photographs of them. They were still doing it in the 20th century. I've seen photographs of these mutilated bodies. And they're celibate. But the women are leaders of communities, mothers of communities, mothers of ships, they call each of their communities. And we know of contacts between Jacob Frank. He traveled a lot in Poland, in the regions where these communities were very secretive, usually in forests, away from, because they had been persecuted and they fled in the course of the 18th century. And so there's one ritual that is described by a French traveler who traveled in the region, who traveled all over Russia and Poland, and he describes one of these communities and a ritual he witnessed of them. It's a little bit later, I mean, this is from the first decade of the 19th century, whereas Jacob Frank dies in 1791. But the ritual is strikingly similar to rituals described in the Frankists' own sources, where they take place outdoors, they go out to a clearing in the forest, they form a circle in which one half is men, one half of women, facing each other, separate but facing each other. They then form a kind of, like children, forming a bridge, and everybody has to go under it, with the men first and then the women, and then doing all kinds of peculiar dance things, and then some answering back. Anyway, there's a description by this neutral traveler, which is almost word for word, the description of one of the rituals that Jacob Frank institutes. He had all kinds of weird things. I mean, there were kind of dances on the parapets of the fortress that surrounds the Asmagora. I walked on them, it's very exciting. And when he has, everybody, the men first, and then the women have to go and then lift their one leg and then turn around and lift another and then face each other and then go apart. Strange things, which may well come from there. So there is a certain kind of cross-religious, sectarian affinity that could be explained by geographic proximity and actual contacts that are thinly documented, but documented.
We don't need movies for this week, I think.
Okay. I'm sorry that I always go over my time.